Hello, what a wonderful museum. I've been here so many times because my mum lives in Leicester, so but it's the first time I've actually spoken here, so I'm very honoured to be here. The talk is going to be on a site, MOLA, or then called Northampton Archaeology, excavated 15 years ago in 2007. The publication happened much later, but the title I've given this talk is From Villa. The site was certainly had a villa adjacent or partly within it, and it was certainly part of the Middle Saxon Minster. Actually linking the villa to the Middle Saxon Minster is impossible, and I failed to do that, but I thought I'd be controversial because it's certainly a significant estate in the Roman period, and was a significant estate in the middle or even early Saxon period. So I've linked the two together. We have never had proof of any site really, certainly not in the East Midlands or even the South Midlands, going from the Saxons to the Romans to the Saxons. But to say it's part of the same estate is pushing the boundaries, but I thought I'd do it anyway. The site has been published in the transactions for 2016, and I'm actually going to expand on that and make more comparisons. So it's going to be partly on the publication, which I, as the introduction said, had nothing to do with. I was in 2007, I think I was digging in Lincolnshire at the time, but I actually helped in the editing for the publication. But Jill Bourne also needs to take a lot of credit because she actually made some very good comments, which certainly strengthened the article in the publication. It's quite nice to actually see some of the artifacts at the back as well of the room. So afterwards, it's well worth seeing some of the artifacts. It's going to be the excavation. The director is actually this guy here. Tim Upson-Smith. The fact he dug a very important Middle to Late Saxon cemetery is probably slightly interesting in that his wife is now a vicar. So he's actually a house husband to their children, but his wife is actually a vicar in Warwickshire. So he left archaeology to become a house husband. I don't think Rothley drove him out, but he within a couple of years he actually gave up archaeology, looked after his kids and his wife, and they're still active in kind of local archaeology, but he's excavated this site very well, and you can see in quite tricky conditions with the rain and other problems. The site itself is right on the south side of Rothley. You've got important River Soar going past, which is very significant to the reason it was founded, both for the villa, which is right next to the major river. Most villas are next to major rivers, and also the Minster Church is also probably significantly affected by the location. The site itself is to the northeast of the St. Mary's Church. The burials here significantly are right beyond the road. So the boundaries of the burials are outside the present boundary, which probably saved them. The boundary of the burial ground became much smaller after the conquest period, and almost certainly they will have about 8-10 burials stacked up on each other in this area, and it would have removed almost certainly all the earlier burials. The reason these survive is because they're outside the excavation area, outside the burial area, and in an area which was not developed in the medieval period or post-medieval period. And they were survived just below the topsoil, in the subsoil. So unlike 6 feet down, these burials are about 20 centimeters down below the ground level. And it shows a remarkable survival. It may be the reason why so few Saxon burials are ever excavated is because most of them have been truncated by later development, especially in burial grounds. And the fact that this one survives is one of the few in the, I'd say in Britain really, for the early Middle Saxon Minster period burial ground of this size. It's 150 burials are looked at. The ground itself, as you can see, is still undeveloped until the housing was built. And it's this is from the church tower, and the burial ground is in this area here. So it's been really in the post-medieval period, just gardens, and for the major house up here, up there, sorry. The Saxon cross is here. So if you want to remember, the Saxon cross is a late 8th century, 9th century cross here, while the burial ground, as I said, is in rows. I'll look at it more in depth now. When we excavated it, as we said, it was massively overgrown. So basically, a lot of this shrubbery had to be taken back and then machined off very carefully. Because as you see, sorry, have I missed one? No, is the fact that the archaeology is just below the ground level. This is the Roman remains. The Roman remains on the sites. This is the burial ground here, which stopped just in front of the Roman remains, which may be significant. There is no Roman remains here, but the Saxon burials, apart from one or two outliers here and there, stopped just in front of where this area is. We've got a building here. The most important thing is that there was about in 1722, 15 meters to the south of here in the vicarage, a kind of a nice pavement was found, and that should imply it's a villa. Certainly the fact that you got right next to the river and you don't get many tessellated pavements anywhere. The fact that there's also the remains that are this far to the south, I mean the excavation area, these are probably the outlying buildings for the villa estate. So you're talking probably barns and things like that. But the main buildings for the villa is about 50 meters below here. We found an incredible amount of tiles. The tiles we found, most of them were slate, but we basically got 815 sherds in the excavation weighing 521 kilograms. And they range from a few box flue tiles to flat tiles, but most of them were these slate, quite high status tiles. We've taken them out and just rearranged them to make them look nice. But this is one of the post pits for the building we saw on the previous area. So it's that, I think it's that one post hole there. So you've got the building going into this area there, nice metaling area here, yard surfaces, and the tile spread is here. We're not too sure. The post pads are quite large. It could have held a building of this size. It's certainly in a Romanized sub-rectangular design. It's not like a roundhouse. It's quite well built, well done, quite deep structure. And you've got a boundary ditch up here and another boundary ditch up there for the Roman period. But we are just on the edge of the area. But the amount of roof tile is significant. The kind of pottery we're getting, it ranged from quite high status amphora to imitation kind of Oxford ware mortaria in the same kind of slipware late Roman period. The Roman artifacts dated from really up to the late 4th century, and they started in the 1st century AD. So you've got this Harlow type brooch here, as well as that very nice 4th century coin here. Forget the medieval, but there's also got steel weights here. The main area, we had relatively little Roman in this area, but it's obviously expanded far larger area. the main area of interest is the Saxon burial. This is what the late Alan Vince said in the regional research frameworks for 2006 for the East Midlands. He said that late 7th to 9th century cemeteries of any size have rarely been excavated in the East Midlands. He said it was a period, a missing phase between pagan cemeteries of the Saxon period and the establishment of most parish churches in the 10th and 11th century. So the importance of this site is the fact we've got 150 burials of a Minster church securely dated to the 7th, from really around the about 700 to the pre-conquest period. And I think it's probably the most important Minster cemetery found certainly in the East Midlands, and it rivals excavations from places like Wing in Buckinghamshire. But it is, I'd say the site is of national importance. The fact is there are likely to be other areas possibly surviving outside the present boundary of the graveyard. Inside, as I said, it will not have survived. It would have been destroyed by almost certainly by the later development of the burial ground. And what I said here is in the publication is that it helps to address the imbalance as the excavation. It is probably the largest examined one in the East Midland area. The burials themselves are in rows, so you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and you've got a few outlier ones. One of the problems is that you've got the burials are just below the topsoil in the subsoil, so there's a lot of disturbances. So even though you've got 149 definite ones, you've got charnel remains where you've got later disturbances, and you've got other ones which are likely to be other ones. So you could probably have a 200 or 250 in this area, and there's few intercutting. So the density is quite, it's not major, but it's well planned. Most of them are rows, implying that there is likely to have been grave markers in the main. The burials, as you see, is just on the topsoil. This is the ground surface now, and you're basically 20 centimeters down. And you can see the burials are extremely poorly survived in parts. I think they're, in terms of teeth, there's only about 50 burials with decent teeth in it, which you can actually make comments on. So basically, luckily, we machined very shallow, we had to be very delicate, and virtually you can't find grave cuts. So in the main, the deepest one is probably about this, where you can basically see the skull is just below the natural here. So, and this burial comes from, it's probably, is one of the few ones cut in the natural, and you can see it's on that, the primary row on the western side, about 4th one down. These are we actually carbon dated 8 burials from around the burial ground, and you can see it's quite closely dated. And we tried to get ones which are the earliest and some of the latest ones. So we did different rows, different types, sometimes earlier and later ones nearby. And you can see the earliest date is, the start of it is 680, and it may go into the 8th century. So the probability is going to be within this area here, and likely be one of those peaks. But you can see it's fairly closely dated, and it doesn't go beyond the conquest period. And that's quite significant because certainly by the 11th century, Minsters were going and declining in importance and size. So to be abandoned, the last burial ground here, before conquest, is not surprising, but it has a nice range of groups. And this date here certainly takes back our earliest date for Christianity in Rothley, at least, because you got a late 8th century, 9th century cross, but this burial predates this. The the burials are still in archives, so they could do further analysis if anyone wants to, especially nowadays. This was dug 15 years ago, but there's so many new advances on doing DNA and other things that it can be researched further. This burial ground, as I said, is of national, I would say regionally stroke nationally important, and it's the largest of each group. So if you do want to do further research and get money towards it, which is going to cost a fair amount of money, this is one of the main burial grounds to actually attempt to look at. It's a very nice, closely grouped one with men, women, and children, and in groups. So, some of them survive well enough to merit a lot of further work, and it will change our history because we have very few DNA analysis in this area. And certainly not from this period for East Midlands. The burials themselves, this is the earliest one we carbon dated, which is in the primary row on the western side, second one up. So we'd expect the burials in this area to start here and maybe go this way and go later. On the whole, it seems to happen to a certain extent that, though there's a few, and the latest ones seem to be around here. So there is certainly, we think, certainly this row was probably one of the first to get started, or if not the first. And this burial here, it's dated 650 to 780 with 95% probability. The survival we can see is the main bones survive, but none of the smaller bones. And the latest carbon date is actually, as I said, right, this one here, which is right near the bulk of the excavations on the southern side. The road is going through here, which divides that to the cemetery here, the present cemetery. So this date here, again, you got very, very poorly, very fragmentary, disturbed burials, but it's given a very good date. The date of the last one is 880 to 1020 AD with 95% probability, so it's definitely before conquest. The later disturbance is partly, as you see, there's a sewer pipe going through it, so you've got, that's probably Victorian in date. But you've got also a couple of different burial practices. Most of the ones you've seen, which I've shown you, were supplying on their backs, hands normally all by their legs. This one is one of the few which actually had hands over the pelvis, and more importantly, it had a stone in its mouth. So there's two examples in the burial ground which had stones in its mouth, and this is normally a sign of a pre-conquest date anyway. This kind of burial rite is seen elsewhere in low numbers. Yeah, so this burial here is actually this one here, which is about the fourth row along. The date of the burials varies. So I thought I'd give you a table showing that you've actually got a couple of infant burials, you've got a couple of child burials, adolescents, and young and unknown juveniles, but the old is relatively few. Most people here were dying, the old, I assume, if I remember rightly, is over 40, 45. And this is the 149 calculated. These are the articulated one. We haven't calculated the disarticulated burials, but these are the of the 149 ones. This is meant to be of a 9-year-old, and you can see the non-fused bone on the legs. And that one is there. It's actually in the middle between two lines, actually, so slightly unusual. Some of the bones survive better than others, so actually having small children it's meant that some of the burials survived in not too bad condition, but the type of burial shows us a very mixed burial ground from this period. We got a series of men and women. This is a female burial. Her lower left premolar has been moved, so she's had problems with her teeth. And this burial here is this one here. You also got other. This is an adult male, believe it or not. You can. I don't know how the specialist said that, but it's a very good person. So she probably did it based on the skull. You date your sex burials either on pelvis, or skulls, or any or size, and you say probable. But this one says definite, so there must have been a reason why she said that. The pathology, we actually had some pathology. We got here, both these two burials had well-healed metacarpals. And so the burials on the whole had reasonable health. There are only a few, partly because of condition maybe, but on the whole they seem to survive reasonably well into certainly middle age or young to middle age. But you also have occasional areas of trauma. This one had a badly healed compound fracture to the femur, which allowed infection to set in and may have been the cause of this person's death. So, as I said, you can see how poorly survived, but it's enough to survive in a few areas to actually make comments. This burial here had problems with the spine, so even in reasonably poorly, that's the spine only survived in areas, but it's enough to actually tell us that they had problems. And you probably may be able to see the lines in here. These are indicator of hypoplastic lines, which is normally in childhood where you had bad health, and teeth can be seen when you have lines on this. It's really from the young age, and it's meant that this person in childhood didn't have a good diet and had problems. And 11 of the burials have these lines on it. But if you consider only 50 of the individuals had observable teeth, this counts to a prevalence rate of 22%. So that's reasonably high. So even though I said there weren't many broken bones and things like that, the dietary problems, certainly from the early age, is actually quite noticeable. And this is true of quite a few early to Middle Saxon burial grounds found in these Midlands. And you can include places like Great Houghton, where you also had major problems with health. And you probably can say some into Cambridgeshire, like Brampton, which I'm just helping to publish of the same period in near Huntingdon. So certainly health in the Saxon period isn't wonderful in the early Middle Saxon period in some areas. This one here, the impacted third molar is visible here. It's only visible because unfortunately the top of the area, the bone in this area actually has gone, but you can see the angle of it shows it's impacted. This is the burial here, and you can just about probably one of those teeth there. This burial survives reasonably well, it is the luckiness of that post-mortem break actually showing us the tooth at this angle very clearly. This shows this individual had a problem, bone found in the cranial vault, dense. And so you can actually get quite a lot from burials. So burials like this are quite important to actually analyze in detail. and only one burial was in a coffin. All the rest would have been shroud burials, or almost certainly all shroud burials. There were no coffin nails, there weren't anything else. And the reason his right hand was articulate, but had been moved away from the shoulder, as had the lower left arm, probably after decay, which would have been occurred if it was within a shroud, would not have occurred if it's within a shroud. It may also mean that it was actually transported to this place. If it was in a coffin, it may have been, as Rothley was a mother church, and probably and had, as we'll see later, extensive landing holdings around Rothley over a kind of 18, 20 plus kilometre by, I think, about 30-kilometre area. It is possible that one of these people from that area has been brought back in a coffin, and the decay was because of this, and because it was actually decaying in the coffin before it was buried. You can actually see there is recutting. So the burial ground, even though it probably had grave markers, you got very nice lined and in rows. You actually, this burial here, kicked out, or an earlier burial remains disarticulated next to it. So you certainly had at least 2 burials. And other burial grounds, Harringworth, which I myself excavated in the Corby area of, or just out, it's actually on the borders of near Empingham in Rutland area, right next in Northamptonshire Rutland border, that had burials on top of each other. You had an upper burial and a lower burial. And so this, we haven't got it in this instance, but you've got actually a reuse of the burial ground, and in certain other areas, you've certainly got evidence for that in Rothley. So it looks like they were using this area, this outlying area to the north, over a fair amount of time. This one had actually probably 4 burials in here. I had a relook of the records, and basically it's been disturbed partly through modern disturbances, but almost certainly it would have been at least 2 of them. So probably when this came in, this lot here is from this pipeline disturbance, but this one certainly had 2 burials in this area as well. So it is one of the shames of this site is that the bone doesn't survive in great condition. Of the burials, complete burials, you've basically got those under 25% complete. You've got 92. So 92 of the 149 are less than 25 complete. And only a few are actually more extensive. So if you look there, you've got 120, and there was less than 10, which are more than 75% complete. But enough survives to actually give us a lot of evidence, and over 50 teeth, burials with teeth, and these could easily give us a lot more information, and through new ways of looking at burial grounds, through DNA and other things. The burial ground I was going to show you, this is the present burial ground there. Our excavation area is here. So it's basically in an area which hasn't been developed. This is the first OS map. This map shows the that's showing the vicarage had Roman Roman pavement. This is the vicarage. So the Roman pavement was actually found in 1722, assuming when the vicarage was built here. So this is the main settlement for the villa, and you can see the church, the main church, is adjacent. So that seems a coincidence, not a coincidence. You've got places like Castor in near Peterborough, where you've got a very important Roman villa, which was then a Middle Saxon Minster. And you've got other examples of that. Even in Empingham, you've got a Roman villa with about 6, 7 Saxon burials cut through it in the 7th century. So there is certainly reuse of villa sites, partly to, I presume, to get some of the stonework, but also it may imply that they continued in use between those two periods. It may be more than a coincidence. So, how do I do that? How do I do it? Sorry about that. Slightly worrying when the computer goes to sleep, so hopefully I'm not that boring, so we should bore the computer to sleep. Anyway, as I said, this is the Saxon, the present burial ground. This is where the main villa, almost only where the pavement was found in 1722, and this is where our outlying area of the burials. If you think these burials are dates from probably around 700 to 900, it's more likely that the earlier burials would have been near the church, especially on the south side. And this is where these cross, the late 8th century, 9th century cross is based. The fact there's very little medieval and post-medieval can see by the fact that you got wells on the site in the medieval period. This is one of the medieval wells, and it's largely agricultural throughout that period, and hence this allowed a cemetery just below the ground level to carry on. So this is really just pastoral farming in this period. You got one or two other small pits and a couple of small ditches, and in the post-medieval period you got greenhouses. But this lack of development is so unusual, so that's why so few burial grounds survive. In small towns and large villages, you almost always get dense development certainly in the 18th and 19th and 20th centuries. In this place in Rothley, it didn't expand. Even in the late 19th century, this village was actually very, very small. So it's probably, in terms of Saxon period, it probably hadn't actually increased in size for 1,000 years, which is unusual. I'm now going to go into kind of overview discussion of what we are and why I think it's certainly, this is an example of the Professor Upex putting boundaries to villas in the nearby around Peterborough area. So you've got basically the River Nen here, and I'm going to make comparisons with the River Soar, where you basically got villas right next to the river, the main river, and this is his conjecture boundaries. And he's basically saying, and it's likely to be examples of the villas controlling really and having a lot of these estate areas, and quite a lot of the and they would have influence in this area. So you've got all there's going to be numerous farmsteads, but the villa, and certainly excavations in Wollaston, Northamptonshire, where you've got massive vineyards growing next to the River Nen, next to a Roman villa, and the amount of money it would have cost to actually have a massive villa, a vineyard, would have only been able to be paid by rich people like a villa estate. So certainly examples of Wollaston, which is probably about 10, 15 kilometres down there, is very similar to what I think is happening in quite a few of these areas where you actually got villa estates having, and those areas rich enough to control the area and land around it. And it's not too much of a leap of faith to say that it could have happened in the Saxon period as well, where the villa estate of the Roman period continued or at least influenced the area later. sorry for this dense kind of record here, but I'm really saying that there is no early Saxon remains. So we are putting it's a bit of a leap of faith from saying a villa estate to a Minster church, but we really don't know what's happening in this period. And it may be a coincidence that you actually have a villa on the site, and then you've got a very important Saxon, Royal Saxon soak. Yeah, so I think you can actually put your and say it's a possibility, even though it may not, maybe only a possibility. So the Royal soak of Saxon soak of Rothley has been examined and is recorded over 25 by 19 kilometre area. It is also worth considering whether Rothley continued for, and the examples elsewhere, in attempting to explain the relationship between villas and Minster churches, it has been observed that the majority of English churches are proprietary in origin, owing to their foundation to the initiative of lay lords, and that their location may indicate villa estates that continued into the Saxon period, maintained in the same administrative centre. This is Nick Cooper, which some of you will know. We also, I thought we'd look into where we are in relation to Saxon boundaries, where this is Leicester here, so roughly just above it, and we're in the dark green, which is the inner Mercia area in the 7th century. This is the 7th century boundary of, and the subordinate, this is the Middle Angles, which is in really in just beyond Northamptonshire into Cambridgeshire, and you got Gloucestershire, Worcestershire, and other things. And you can see some of the battles they had in this period. So it's a very expanding Mercia period. So we're in the middle, inner Mercia, and Mercia was became Christian largely in the middle 7th century under King Penda. So right when we're starting here, we're actually we're in the middle of an important Saxon land holdings called Mercia, and in a period when it was very wealthy and going Christian. And I thought I'd also show you what Christian Mercia and selected Minster churches. So in the 8th and 9th century. And you can see Leicestershire is actually quite important. It had its own diocese from 737. And by splitting up, you had other dioceses formed in the same kind of period. So the former Mercia was actually being divided. And with Christianity taking over, it got more churches, more people. So you needed more bishoprics, and that's why you've actually got dividing into different dioceses in this period. When in the mid-7th century, Bede was actually commenting on how few priests there were, and the difficulty of having, and he actually had a bishop for both the Middle Angle area and also Mercia. Whereas by the middle 8th century, you're actually getting far more churches, far more Minster churches, far more dioceses, being a few more dioceses, meaning that Christianity is really taking a hold, far more priests, and the burial practices changed. So what do you have here is the only really, you've got Peterborough, which was founded in 653. So that's really an early period. Oundle, which is mentioned by Bede in 707 and with its own estate. And you've got the only, I think it's that one is Bredon, which is the only place in Leicestershire with documentary records from this early period for Minster. So very few records in this whole area. But it shows the fact that you're actually expanding, and you've got quite a few saints, and you've got important Minster churches. Rothley is not mentioned in any Anglo-Saxon charters, but is noted in the Domesday Book of 1086 that the king holds Rothley. King Edward held it, and it gives land, and it says about how big an area it was and but it's also one of only 4 soap centres in Leicestershire and Rutland, and seems to fall within Gilbourne's definition of early to middle Saxon majored land units, which covered perhaps 250 square kilometres. So the land holdings it had is over that 19 by 20 odd kilometre area. And Senny Parsons in 96 implied he thought it was a minster, and so it was one of the 3 major minsters in Leicestershire and Rutland. Others being at Bredon and Oakham. So it shows how important Rothley was in that period, and perhaps a further 5 lesser minsters than known in Leicestershire. So, and the important comment here is that Patrick Hayes in his researches in the mother churches of Hampshire noted that they were located originally in royal estates. We are part of the royal estate owned by the king, and the major land holdings can be seen here. Dr. McCuffin's 2010 PhD from University of Leicester on medieval Rothley is very important to read if you're interested in Rutland, in Saxon, and also the land holdings of Rothley in particular. And it shows how much the different areas they controlled, either by them actually paying payment to the church, or actually being owned by the parish. So the land holdings you can see here, mentioned here, and it covers, as I said, Rothley is around there. So a lot of it's to the east of it, but it covers an area of about 19 by 25 kilometres. And that shows the major soak of, and I said, one of the 4 major soaks in the county. These are some of the other minsters certain projected or possible. So you basically got places like Rothley, Barrow, Bredon, which was the first documentary, the only real documentary for early things. And the excavations we found certainly strengthens the fact that Rothley, even though it's undocumented, is almost certainly a minster church. It is a minster church. So minsters themselves were, if you don't know what they are, they're really smaller churches of the Bishop's Cathedral, and they had the gift of burial. So you had very few in the 8th century really parishes. And they were the mother churches, so most of the burials went to the minster church. Only a few burial grounds like Empingham, where you obviously had a few cut into the former villa there. But on the whole, Rothley was in fact really a mini cathedral, really. In that early period, it was so powerful. And this is the Saxon cross. If you haven't seen it, it's definitely worth going to. And it's thought to be in its original position. So it dates generally to, is likely to date to the late 8th or 9th century. And it may be a funeral monument rather than a preaching cross, according to Stafford. The present church has some Norman features, but largely dates to the 13th and 14th century and has been heavily restored by the Victorians, restored in inverted commas. The importance of Leicestershire, unfortunately, is that it has very few documentary records. This is from Professor Blair's book, showing the incidence of evidence for continuity between minsters and the mother churches in this period there. And the denser shading the higher visible survival of early organisation in the later period. Leicestershire is in the minimal survival. So there's very little survival between the minster where there would have been minsters, and when the in the conquest period when you got churches being formed or 10th, 11th century everywhere, and parishes got much smaller and subdivided the former Minster parish. But Leicestershire is probably, I think Blair says it was probably the third, within the third worst documentary record surviving in the whole country by county. But in terms of elsewhere, Warwickshire is much better survival. But it's not that surprising because very few Saxon churches evidence for Saxon. You've got the Minster, there's very few bits of, I think, Leicester in itself, near the Roman remains, that church there is got a late Saxon window or two, but elsewhere very few churches have evidence for Saxon architecture surviving. And there is so little documentary records. Blair singles out Leicestershire as one of only 3 counties where there are relatively settled areas, but the numbers of known Minster churches are thin. And Blair asked the quite pertinent question, did these counties really have fewer Minsters than counties such as Worcestershire? Or is it because of the fact that they got so little documentary records that that we don't know where they are? And as I say, I think Rothley is an undocumented Minster church, but the evidence is significant that it is one. I would like to compare burial grounds of known and undocumented Minsters, showing the similarity between Rothley here and other known examples excavated. This is Wing in Buckinghamshire, and again, you've got a divide from the present burial ground, where the burial ground goes out of use here, and the burials excavated here. I'm going to go into a bit more detail later, again in rows, and again a great distance from the church and far beyond the present boundaries. This is Aylesbury in Buckinghamshire. These are known burials found undated, but a few have been carbon dated. And this is Harringworth. This church dates on the other side of the road. This is the Seaton Road. This dates to the Norman. Again, like Rothley, it has Norman architecture, but nothing before it. But there's also a hermitage here, and the burials here, and we actually did another evaluation here later, and the burials I looked at here are all 8th, 7th to 9th century. And the burials go up to here when this shed was built in 67. So you've got the burial ground going where this hermitage only dates, the present building only dates to 1305. But the fact that it's got these really very early burials here implies that this church was much earlier in date. And it's actually was abandoned in the medieval period and became houses. So it's actually survived as houses, but the architecture only dates to 1300. But this church is a Norman church, and I think it's almost certainly that this is actually where the Minster church was. And after the fall and the decline of Minsters, it actually moved. So I'm going to look at this in more detail later. These are the Wing churches. So this is Wing in Buckinghamshire, excavated by Northampton's Archaeology and published in the records of Buckinghamshire in, I think, 2008, if you want to read that. And it's actually got part of the ambulatory actually dates to the 8th century. And it had major land assets. Like other Minster churches, land assets are important, such as in Rothley. And the burials here are 77 burials. If you think of how many burials there would have been if we go all the way up here and beyond, you also got areas in between which weren't excavated, and this is only where we only excavated where they developed. So there's actually still burials in between around there. And the burials there, almost all are pre-conquest and all date largely to the 8th to the 9th. And the latest, there's only a few late burials going into the 12th or early 13th century. So virtually this area here was virtually abandoned as a burial ground, and only one or two later ones. I think it's under 15, under 10, I think, is post-conquest. And as with Rothley, it's a mixture of adults, males, and a few juveniles and adults. So it shows it's not a monastery, but it's safe for the local people. This is the example I'm using from Aylesbury. It's probably also a king's property in the 6th century. So it's very similar to Rothley and continued in the 7th century. And it had 4 dependent chapels outside Aylesbury. And its most likely conversion was through this guy here in the 7th century again. And he built and dedicated, there's documentary records where he built and dedicated several churches. And it was found across the hilltop, and where they have been carbon dated, they're all the same period, this pre-conquest period. Again, as I said, they're well away from the present burial ground, which the earlier Minster burial ground expanded, was declined in size. This is my my Harringworth one, which I excavated. It had burials 2 deep, and the lowest ones were dated to the 7th to 8th century, and the upper ones to the mid-8th to the 9th century. So you've actually got again 2 sequences in that area, and I think there's probably more than 1,000 individuals here found through myself and through Liz. You have to look in the reason why Minsters went out of use is the rise of the parish church in the 10th century and 11th century. Parishes became much smaller. So we've in Rutland, you've got places like Ketton, where the former Minster church, then you got an excavation done by my unit a few years ago at Ketton, found a church, and 10th to around 10th to early 11th century burial ground. So the rise of small churches in the 10th and 11th century really took over from Minster churches. And Minster churches' boundaries may have been a policy applied across most of Saxon England. Certainly by the 10th century, Minsters were becoming far less powerful. And with the rise in population and rise in wealth, people wanted to be buried in their own area. And with populations rising, led to more parishes and more churches. So burials, like Rothley, contracted in size. And it seems that churches normally demark boundaries. It's what it shows in Rothley is actually the decline of the Minster church probably massively affected Rothley throughout its history, and that's why it declined into really a village into the 20th century. I mean, and its reason why is actually the burials actually survive. So as I said, the importance to Rothley is that you've got a major Minster church, you've got the villa, and you've got good survival on the whole of the remains because of lack of development in the post-medieval period. If you want to have an example in Leicestershire of an important area to excavate in the future, Rothley is one of these areas you really do need to look at and to get more information. And that's the end of the talk. If you've got any questions, please, I'm very interested to answer them.